So we're doing the morning brocha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah v'arevnu Adonai Eloheinu divrei Torah tcha b'finu b'fiah b'cha beit Yisrael v'nireh anachnu v'tzeitzeinu v'tzeitzeim b'cha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lumdei toratech lishma Baruch atah Adonai Amlemei Torah l'amo Yisrael Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato Baruch atah Adonai notenu Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Let's get started. Thanks for all coming back. Okay. What I'm going to do is just give a summary of where we were yesterday. We were on 4b3 of the Gemara, and the first day, what we did deal with in the shir was about the thief and the robber. Yesterday, we're dealing with Eidim Zomimim. Now, today, I just want to do a bit of progress because we've spent on 2 words, 2 days of an extended shir, Lag BaOmer aside, where it was a double length yesterday, which wasn't entirely necessary to drag out. So if I can just get a little bit of traction here, I'd appreciate it. So in terms of Eidim Zomimim, I'm going to give a 5-minute review. Eidim Zomimim are conspiring witnesses, and those witnesses that are discredited through a special process known as hazama. So what that happens is that the first group of witnesses are testifying against an individual that he committed a crime. And then it's found out that there's a second pair of witnesses that have been in a different location with the first pair of witnesses, so they couldn't possibly testify to the crime of this innocent individual. And there is a process whereby the second group of witnesses are checked in terms of their valid testimony, because the individual being defended could in fact have gotten the second pair of witnesses to discredit the first pair of witnesses. So that is a complicated affair in terms of how all the witnesses are checked. Because obviously an innocent person is going to use, a person on the defendant side is going to use whatever he can in his capacity to try and get the case thrown out of court. Sometimes the person is innocent, but if they're not, sometimes they try and tamper with witnesses. So all of this is found in Makos 5a. And what we were discussing yesterday is Eidim Zomimim consists of different categories. You could have false witnesses that conspire to get somebody lashed. You could have false witnesses that can try and get a person killed. Sometimes they could try and get 2 people killed. So if they pretend to witness an adultery, more than one person is going to suffer at their hand. And in addition, what Eidim Zomimim can do is pretend that they've witnessed somebody stealing money or owing money so that that person suffers a financial loss. So whatever the intention is to do to this defendant, once they found out to be conspiring witnesses and having given false testimony, it's at that point that they what they intended to do to their victim is done to them exactly. So if they intended to give the victim 39 lashes will be done according to them. So the Gemara asks yesterday, Rav Oshaya, who did not teach penalties and only taught compensation, didn't include the Eidim Zomimim because it looks like, to a certain extent, it is compensation. So Michael, obviously, you had to collect a delivery yesterday. So just to put you in the picture, what actually happened is it looks on first glance to be compensation. In other words, if I try and get you to pay the court, for example, 300 Rand, okay, and I'm proved to have my testimony and another person's testimony to be false against you, we have to pay 300 Rand. And in that case, it looks like compensation because whatever we try to do to you is done to us. But it turned out that it was actually a penalty because there is another feature of Eidim Zomimim, and that feature of Eidim Zomimim is as follows, is that the witnesses have to be caught to be conspiring witnesses prior to the conviction being made and meted out and carried out. So, for example, if after the event where the person is executed, it comes to light that the witnesses testified falsely against him in terms of adultery, for example, and he got executed, the male and the female got executed, or it was found out afterwards that that innocent victim of the defendant was not subject to lashes or financial payment, and the court case is done and the punishment is meted out, the Eidim Zomamim are not punished in the way they intended to do to their victim. And we're going to go through the reason why now. So because it's not meted out in the actual case, it's actually a penalty. What I'm saying is as follows.
Compensation.
Sorry, I apologize, Marco. It's not compensation. In other words, if for example, I actually cost you 300 Rand in my false testimony, then if my payment back was 300 Rand, that's compensation. Okay? So because I'm paying exactly what I did to you. But if I'm paying you 300 Rand on what I intended to do to you, and you didn't lose the 300 Rand, you could have, but you didn't because it was found out during the trial, then that in fact is a penalty. Mm-hmm. It's a penalty because you never sustained any loss whatsoever. That's number one. Number two, there's a peculiar feature in terms of Eidim Zomamim, and that feature is as follows. That feature is that once that person is convicted, the Eidim Zomamim are not given the same penalties. So before you worry and figure out they got away with it, just remember Hashem never forgets anything, ever. So they are responsible in the hands of Shemaim. Stalin, who appeared to get away with things, and every other wicked person through history, make no mistake that there's retribution when they die, and they're held fully accountable for everything they've done wrong. We just can't see it in this world, so it doesn't feel satisfactory. But the reason why that punishment isn't done is because let's take an example of what punishment actually is. And this is an important point, Arthur, because you don't know about Eidim Zomamim yet. You hadn't learned it in Sanhedrin or in Makos. And what the story with this Eidim Zomamim is that if you actually get a punishment to you in this world, you've paid a certain penalty for it as a kapara. So kapara means that in order to get a spiritual cleansing, you have to regret what you've done, you have to suffer for what you've done, and you have to vow never to do it again. So what happens is sometimes when somebody gets punished in this particular world for something, it acts as almost a cleansing process, a cathartic process, that through the pain they feel, they have a sensitivity about the damage they've caused to another person. And it's that particular kapora of that pain that if they're truly regretful and they don't do it again, helps with the cathartic experience where it's not that they're not going to get punished, but to the degree that they really regret what they've done and they've suffered, it does mitigate their punishment by lessening the severity of their punishment to whatever degree that they've truly made a full teshuvah, a full sort of correction. Okay? And the thing of it is it's actually a calmness in a way that we show to Eidim Zomamim. They were caught out in time. And the fact that they lose their lives in this world because they were going to take the life of another meant that to a certain extent it hadn't been meted out yet, but they still lose with their lives, which is much more extreme than what actually happened to the person they tried to do it to. And that serves, if they really use the opportunity well, as a kapora of that suffering, to almost, it doesn't exonerate their sin, but what it does do is they pay for a certain percentage of it in this world through the suffering they undergo, through the penalty. Now, what happens is if they get away with it, inverted commas, in this world, where they actually successfully manage to get somebody, two witnesses, get a couple killed on adultery that never transpired, a kapora is too good for them. They don't deserve any sort of mercy by having mitigating an opportunity in this world to serve part of their crime. In other words, they're not given that merciful opportunity to suffer in this world, where it's meta connected meta, it's measure for measure. Because what they did was so despicable. They used the holy Beit Din and the holy Sanhedrin services, and they corrupted the Sanhedrin and the Beit Din with their lies to make a mockery of the judicial system. And it's a chilul Hashem that they don't deserve any kapara for their sin. They don't deserve any redemption. They're not given any opportunity in this world to suffer in connection with what they did. They might suffer for something else, so that by the time they get to the next world, they're going to have the full wrath of the heavenly court against them with no mercy. Am I making sense to all of you guys?
No,
I need a bit of confirmation.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's clear.
Yeah.
Okay. Kev, is it clear? I mean, you've done this before, I'm sure. Kevin?
Yeah, not this part. Yeah, it's clear. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good. All right. So now that it's clear from all of you, that deals with the Eidim Zomimim. So the reason why it's a penalty is instead of a compensation is a compensation would mean you cost me 200 and then you therefore pay 200 and you're compensating me for the loss. That's number one. Number two, the Eidim Zomimim were caught during the process. Afterwards, they're not given the same punishment, which means if they're caught before you intended to do it to me, I have not actually sustained any loss. And therefore, if you're made to do what you intended to do to me, but you never successfully did what you did to me, that's not compensation because it's not measure for measure. It's more extreme because you didn't successfully meet out your plan. It was foiled prior to it. Okay? And then, on a compensatory basis, there's just one other issue. Is that when, for example, if there was a case where a person lost their lives at the hands of Eidim Zomimim, let's not use Eidim Zomimim. Let's put the thing of a murderer, that a person murdered another person, and they therefore were murdered. It's compensation in the fact that it's compensation from a justice point of view, okay? But it never gives them their life back. If somebody has, for example, sustained 39 lashes and they're ill of health, it's going to affect their life expectancy. If somebody that testified against them, for example, that's why I'm not using Eidim Zomimim, because if they testified against them and had their lashes, the Eidim Zomimim don't get lashed. But just say person A of his own volition damages person B by lashing him, and then the other guy wants to get retribution and lash him back. It still doesn't take away the pain from the first guy. So it's not a completely cathartic level of compensation. Monetary compensation is much more perfect in that regard because you can fix the damage. Whereas when you create physical harm, although you can pay back and compensate to a certain degree to cover costs, you can never really compensate in terms of bodily damage, even if there's a price put to the pain. Am I making any sense, guys? There's no way to fix it in this world totally.
Yep.
Okay, fine. So let's go on. And let's talk about a case of the rapist. Okay, so we're not going to go into it in too much depth because these are a little bit clearer. And the case of Eidim Zomimim has got a biblical reference to Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 16 to 21. Kev, you proud? Kev?
He looks proud.
Okay, good. Okay, good. No, Kevin, you were right, by the way. So that's no issue. So that's where Eidim Zomimim are found. So in terms of the person who rapes or seduces a young and unmarried girl, who's a virgin, there's an entitlement payment of 50 shekels. Because in Exodus chapter 22, verse 15 to 16, and Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 28 to 29, it discusses the two cases. The first one is a rape. The first case in Exodus is about a rape, And the case in Deuteronomy is about seduction of an unmarried girl who's a virgin. Now, I'm just going to explain the slight difference between the two. It's also found in Kesuvot B and 29b, is that there's more payment with regards to a rape because there is an additional payment. A person that is seduced has agreed to it. So let me give you an example why she would. It's not like it was consensual. Let me just give you an example of the difference between pure consent and seduction. So seduction can occur as a result of bribery, okay? That this young girl is put into a situation where the person is bribing her and says to her that is going to come out in the newspapers if you say it, and your father's got a high position in politics, and he's going to lose his social standing, and it's going to mar the reputation of your family. So, you better kind of submit to me, because otherwise, if you report the case, I'm going to say that, in fact, you consented, and you're going to come out to be a very complying person, and your family is going to put into ill repute, and your brother's not going to get any shidduchim. So he seduces her through, for example, I'm just giving this as my own example, through bribery and extortion. So that would be a case of seduction, but she's not consensual. Do you get what I'm saying? So that's as far as that's concerned. And then rape is when she's trying to resist completely, but he's forcing it upon her physically. Now, there is extra payment for rape. One of the payments extra for rape would be pain. Because it's physically against her will, she's resisting, and it obviously causes a lot more pain than somebody that submits to this sort of mutual consent, inverted commas, meaning she didn't consent, but it's better than her being beaten. Another example of a seduction is if he turns around to her and says, listen, I'm going to beat you to a pulp and injure you very badly, or you can just kind of relax about this whole thing and just let it flow. Does that make sense, guys? So there are payments extra for a person that's been raped compared to being seduced. One of them is pain. Mm-hmm. Okay, so just so you know. Now, there's a particular different case, which is that is a payment of 50 shekels, and it's actually generally paid to the woman's father. Now, you might say, why isn't it paid to the girl itself? Because she's under her father's care. So obviously, it's given to her father, but it's not for the father to spend on shopping and at the casino, wherever the father spends. It's for his daughter's benefit, but he's the custodian of the money. Now, in terms of the defamer, this is a very, very difficult one to deal with. So I just want to explain to you what a defamer is. I don't know if anybody knows what a motzi shemra is.
No.
Someone that spreads falsehood. No.
Yeah, but it's a very specific type of falsehood that's discussed in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 19. It's a very specific type. Does everybody know the specific type mentioned there?
No. Can you just
repeat
the
Should I get the Chumash?
You can, but it's going to waste time. Just rather listen to the here afterwards and keep the reference point. It's talking about the word motzi shemra, which is a defamer. Now, a defamer in this case is referring to the classic category mentioned in the Chumash, and it refers basically to a husband who falsely declares in court that his wife was not a virgin when their marriage was consummated. Now, I'm just going to explain to you how it was this, because she committed adultery, according to him, after they were legally married. So what happens now in a marriage process is they do Kiddushin, and then immediately afterwards they do the chuppah. In those days, it could have been as much as a year gap. But they worry today that people might have an indiscretion between the two processes of engagement and marriage. So basically, when you get married, they do the engagement and marriage process together as one ceremony. Because people, obviously, they don't want to have them wait about a year. And the reason why they waited about a year in that house is because when they got engaged, sometimes the girl was quite young, and they'd have to spend the year saving money to get the wedding ready and getting used to the groom, etc., etc. But the marriage was only considered an actual marriage after he consummated the act with beer. Now, beer means obviously sexual intercourse. Okay, so the kedushin was the first part. It's it was the engagement period where you were legally married, that to the extent that you'd have to get a get. But the marriage was only considered a marriage upon consummation of a marriage. Right. Now, this is a period where he produced false witnesses to her adultery. And after the witnesses were found to be false, Adim Zomamim, he must pay a fine of 100 shekels to her father. 100 shekels. Now, this upset me when I first read it. This was about a week or two ago. And I was very upset. I can feel a bit emotional about this thing because I felt it was unfair. I felt it was unfair that he could try and get her killed, okay? And he would only have to pay 100 shekels. Is anybody else upset by this before I tell you the answer?
Sorry, why would she be killed? For adultery?
Okay.
I mean,
yes, that's exactly it. The classic term of a defamer in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 19, is about a case of a defamer where a husband declares in court that his wife was not a virgin when their marriage was consummated. And in other words, between the process of kedushin, which they initially got engaged with, in those days was contractual marriage, but he hadn't consummated yet, and then he would actually consummate the marriage, and he would actually say that he realized upon inspection, etc., that his wife, he suspected her of not being a virgin, and then found witnesses to testify the fact that she had an indiscretion in the time period in between. Okay?
So why would she get killed for that?
Because it's adultery.
Are you killed for adultery?
Yes, obviously. We learned that in Sanhedrin.
No, that's right. I'm just checking. It's been a while. Okay.
All right, no more questions. All right, so guys, before, just wanted to go through this quickly, is that it upset me that he would not end up getting death penalty for something that he would try and get her the death penalty for. Okay? Because it seemed like Adim Zommerman. He'd only have to pay 100 shekel fine. Okay? And this is the reason that he only has to pay 100 shekel fine. Firstly, as a single witness, his testimony doesn't stick. He would need, he would actually need, I don't know whose phone that is.
I can't control that. It's an alarm. I can't even if my volume's
no
off.
problem. Okay, let's get on with it.
Okay,
he would actually need 2 witnesses to have witnessed the adultery. Okay? And in order to declare that she committed adultery. So the thing of it is the Adim Zommerman, if they found out to be Adim Zommerman before the trial was over, then they would get the death penalty. He would not get the death penalty because it's known as groma. It's indirect. If you hire a hitman and that hitman kills somebody, you are responsible, and Hashem will hold you responsible in Shemaim for the murder. But the Adim Zomamim the court can only convict a hitman because he did the action. He actually did the action. And the reason being is that every human being, both Jewish and non-Jewish, knows it's forbidden to murder. It's innately in every culture. So the fact that that person took on the role as the hitman, or a pair of people took on the role of false witnesses, they in fact know the law. Everybody knows the law in the country of murder. You have to be a complete moron not to know that for murder you get the death penalty, especially in ancient times. So therefore, since they took on the responsibility of the sin, they will pay for the sin with their lives. They had the choice to say, guys, I'm not interested in being your hitman, your false witness, etc. So they get the death penalty directly. Groma, indirect, in other words, plotting to get somebody killed doesn't get a death penalty on earth, but it gets a death penalty at the hands of heaven. That's number one. Number two, 100 shekel fine was the maximum fine that could be imposed in a divorce settlement. And the reason that they impose him with 100 shekel fine is because the reason he wanted to get her killed is he might have been unsatisfied with her sexually and figured, I'm going to be stuck with this woman. He might have been miserable. But the court allows for a Jewish man, male or female, to get divorced. So the reason he had her killed is he was stingy. He didn't want to pay the money to get a divorce. That's why he got her killed. Because a man can institute a divorce even if the wife isn't keen on it. Okay, so he had the power to have a normal divorce and pay the full divorce settlement. But because he didn't want to lose the money, Mida keneged Mida, he's paying the maximum divorce settlement, and 100 shekels in those days. Remember, in the temple contribution to build the Mishkan, you only paid half a shekel. 100 shekels would be the equivalent of 2 houses or whatever it was. That would cripple you. So he would pay the maximum penalty, and he was not allowed to get divorced if she didn't want to get divorced. In other words, if he wanted to get away with her, he had a legal means at that time. And now at this point, if she doesn't want to get a divorce because she said, you ruined my reputation, he would have a miserable marriage till the day he died. There would be no way that he'd be able to get out of it if she wanted to keep the marriage. Can you imagine having those parents as in-laws and a wife that you tried to murder? That's a life built in hell, plus losing all your assets to her. So believe me that the Beis Din did this in a way to discourage any sort of man from trying to knock his wife off when he should have been paying the money in a divorce settlement. So it was Mida keneged Mida. Okay, I'm done. Any questions?
Happy.
Good. Guys, are you happy?
Yeah, very happy.
5 minutes, eh?
Okay, that's fine. Now, I just want to then go on and say what the next actual sin was. Now, there's one who contaminates someone's product with tumah. Okay, so what does that mean in a nutshell? Is that here it talks about a classic case of there's a product, a tumah means that you take a sheretz, which is a carcass of one of 8 creatures, and you infect food with it, and that you contaminate teruma. So what that means, let's just take an easier case. Let's just take, because the Gemara I picked up actually in Aaron Schottenstein, believe it or not. I'll explain to you what it is another time. But in other words, if your produce is affected with tumah, you can't eat it. I don't know if you know that. It becomes, do you remember we discussed with anything that becomes tumah, you can't eat something that becomes tumah or drink something that becomes tumah.
Is it becomes tameh?
Yes, but tameh is singular, tumah is multiple. So they might have affected many forms of food or drink, or singular. Gavin, no, Kevin, you're right. It could be one item, it could be many.
Okay.
But the point of it is, if you make somebody's produce tumah, you have to pay for that because they can't use it anymore.
Mm.
And if they sell it to a non-Jewish market, by the time they sell it, it could go off. Or it could be worth less of its value. Does that make sense? So anything that you've lessened the value, you have to pay for. And he who mixes teruma in somebody's ordinary produce. So what ordinary produce is that if teruma is there, which is meant for the Kohanim, a normal person can't consume it. It can only be then consumed by a Kohen. Now, if you're selling your product to a limited audience, your price drops because you don't have the luxury to sell to more people at your time. It's like somebody going overseas and immigrating to Australia. You've got a limited time period to sell your stuff, so you take a low price. If you've got a very small segment of the market to sell your product to, and it's a common product, I'm not saying like it's an Apple iPod where you're talking about a niche market, but only very few people are interested in your product. You're at the dictatorship of the buyer. When, for example, many people want your product, you get a higher price for it. So obviously, if your product has teruma in it, and somebody has put that in your product, you can only sell it to a Kohen. So you lose value because a Kohen will pay less for it. Do you remember that the Kohen was obviously supported by the Jewish people? They didn't have a lot of money, and you can't sell it to anybody. So your market has shrunk in terms of how much you can get for your stuff. Okay? So that's with regard to teruma in ordinary produce. The case it brings in the Schottenstein is one who contaminates teruma that belongs to a kohen by touching it with the carcass of a sheretz. This causes the owner a loss, for teruma that is tameh may no longer be eaten. So that's a double loss according to Rashi. In other words, in that case, just let me finish. In that case, a kohen can't have it, nor can the rest of the Jewish population. So obviously on that, you can't even get a fraction of what it's worth. I'm done.
Okay, cool.
Okay, you can't sell that to the non-Jewish market, though.
Yeah, you can, but you know what the reality is.
No, I'm just saying that. No, I'm not going into it. It's fine. I'm just saying that you can.
Yeah, even if you could, you were in many towns. The Jews were in their own particular sort of city. They were far away. I know. The project could go off. You would subject yourself to maybe non-Jewish law then on how you would sell it. You could get into all sorts of trouble. It just wasn't worth it. It's easier to sell it within a community where you both adhere to the same legal system.
Okay. I was asking that whether you could, so you can. I understand that.
But you will sustain a loss.
Yes, I understand.
Because believe me, Jews were second-class citizens. They were maybe given a few pennies on the rand. Any other questions, guys?
Just sheretz. What's the direct literal translation?
So sheretz is one of the avatumos. It's any of the carcasses from the categories of animals, like a lizard or a dead mouse. Or remember, it was an avatuma that we learned in the beginning of one of Rav Papa's examples of the. It was the equivalent of touching a corpse in the semen of a human male. It was one of the biggest levels of tuma that could cause spiritual impurity.
Right.
So that was it. All right, guys. I want to thank you very, very much, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you, Damon. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Cheers,
Much
guys.
appreciate it.
Thanks,
Cheers. Have a good day.
Enjoy.
Cheers, guys.